Okay, today we're going to talk about monomials and factoring. So let's take a look at this. When we talk about factored form, we're talking about a monomial expressed as the product of prime numbers and variables, and no variable has an exponent greater than 1. So let's take a look. There's just two steps to this. So step number 1 would be to prime factor the coefficient completely. Now we've been practicing our prime factorization, so this ought to be a snap for us. And then step number 2 is just to write the variable expression in expanded form. Nothing to it. X to the second power would be x times x. So let's take a look at a couple of examples and see if this makes sense. So we've got 34 x to the fourth y to the third. Well, our first step was to factor 34. Well, 34 is 2 times 17. We're going to write x to the fourth power y to the third in expanded form. Well, that would be x times x times x times x times y times y times y. Then if we write this in factored form, we just put these two together, and so we would have 2 times 17 times x times x times x times x times y times y times y. Let's take a look at one more example. So here we have a negative 52a squared b. Now we haven't talked about having a negative in there. The first thing you need to do if it's a negative number that you're trying to prime factor is to pull out negative 1. So factor out negative 1, and then the rest is just the same. Prime factor positive 52. If we do that, we're going to have negative 1 times 2 times 2 times 4. Excuse me, times 13. I was thinking 2 times 2. So let's look at this. 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 13 is 52. That's kind of a card player's number there. And then if we take that 52 and we multiply it by negative 1, we're back to our negative 52. Now we're going to go ahead and expand a to the second power b, which would be a times b. So negative 52a squared b, if we factored that completely, it would be negative 1 times 2 times 2 times 13 times a times a times b. Now the other thing we're going to be doing today is looking for the greatest common factor between a pair of monomials. So let's take a look at this. The greatest common factor is the greatest number that is a factor of both original numbers. Okay, there's 3 steps to this. The first one is going to be to prime factor each number completely. Step number 2, it's going to be to circle the common prime factors. We're just going to group them, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. And then the third step will be to multiply this circled factors back together, and the result will be your greatest common factor. So let's take a look. Our first example up here, we have 12a squared b squared c, and our other factor is 18ab to the third power. Let's go ahead and factor both these terms. Well, 12 is 2 times 2 times 3, and then a squared is a times b squared is b times b times c. Our next term is 18ab to the third power. Well, 18 is 2 times 3 times 3 times a times b times b times b. Our next step was to circle or group our common factors. Well, here they share a 2. They also share a 3. They share one a, and they share a b here, but they also share another b. So I'm going to list the factors that they have in common. They have a 2 in common, they have a 3, an a, and 2 b's. Our last step was simply to multiply those back together. So if we multiply that back together, our product is 6ab squared. So the greatest common factor between these two terms is 6ab squared. Okay, let's take a look at another example before we move on. Let's take a look at negative 30 q to the third r to the second t, and negative 50 q to the second rt. Well, we know the first thing we're going to have to factor out of negative 30 is the negative 1. So we factor out the negative 1, and then we have 2 times 3 times 5. Q to the third power is q times q times q. R to the second power is r times r, and then t. Again, on negative 50 q squared rt, the first thing we're going to factor out is the negative 1. And then we're just going to prime factor 50, which would be 2 times 5 times 5. Q squared is q times q, then r times t. Now that we have them completely factored, we're going to circle our common factors. In this one, we have a negative 1, a 2, a 5, 2 q's, 1 r, and 1 t. So we're going to list our common factors, which were negative 1, 2, 5, q, q, r, and t. We're going to multiply those together, and that's going to give us a greatest common factor of negative 10 q squared rt. So the greatest common factor between these two terms is negative 10 q squared rt. I hope this helps you understand today's assignment a little bit better. If you have any questions, please reach out to one of us.